Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would review this little video because apparently, for those of you that have not heard the news, Mr. Errol Spence Jr. apparently he has activated his rematch clause, or at least allegedly, from what I keep hearing. Mack, I believe, the trainer of Mr. Terrence Bud Crawford, in a recent interview, he stated that Errol Spence Jr. wanted the rematch or that there is a reinstatement of the rematch clause. I predicted more than likely that there would be a rematch for this fight. It's just the move that I believe personally that Errol Spence Jr. would do. In my view, do I think that it's the best move? No, I don't. Because I think that no matter who you are, but especially for some of these fighters, even for how great that they can be, sometimes I think that it's best that we admit that we're just not ready for a certain situation right now, or that we're not ready to really conquer that mountain quite as of yet. And that's very hard for a fighter to admit because they're pretty much bred, born, and raised, especially if they come from a fighting background. And I'm not sure if Errol Spence really comes from a fighting background, but he's been involved in boxing for a very long time. If I had to guess, probably anywhere from around ages 6, 7, or 8, 9, somewhere around there. He's been involved in professional boxing or boxing as a very long time. This is a situation that he imagined himself in for decades upon decades now when it comes down to it. So it's going to be very hard for Errol Spence to admit to himself that he's debatably not better than this particular fighter right here, and for him to possibly take a step back. And I don't believe that he's going to. In my personal view, I think that it would be the best thing for Errol Spence Jr., but of course, he's in charge of his own entire career. So we'll see. But anyways, Mr. Boxing Eagle, who of course is an Errol Spence fan, but we'll see what he has to say. Let's see what he has to say. Let's go straight into it.
Just a quick update on Terrence. How's things going with him? He had his parade in Colorado. How was that?
Everything's going good. He just texted me. Yesterday and said that Spence 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 activated his rematch. Is that polymonology up there?
Paulie's here, yeah.
Oh, yeah. He just activated his
That's
rematch.
confirmed, is it?
Huh?
That's confirmed.
That's confirmed, but we don't have a date and stuff like that yet.
So do you expect that fight to happen before the end of the year?
I'm hoping.
Just lastly,
Boom, and just like that, the rematch is on. Errol Spence activates his rematch clause. He wants it again with Terrence Bud Crawford. That's what I'm going to talk about in this video. What up, Fight World? It's your boy Eagle.
This is just my personal opinion, and I'm sure that Boxing Eagle is going to claim that Errol Spence, in his opinion, didn't look the same for this fight. And there's a certain amount of people that believe that. Do I believe that? No, not necessarily. Now, if you want to claim that he didn't look like the same in shape, not saying that he was out of shape, but that he's looked better in other fights, you can maybe claim that. But in my view, did I see someone that was severely lesser skilled than what I have ever seen him? No. Errol Spence had all the strengths in the fight that I've seen him prior. He also had all the weaknesses. Not great head movement, not quicker feet than Terrence Bud Crawford, not better counterpunching ability, not better head movement. When it came down to it, at the end of the day, all the weaknesses that Terrence Bud Crawford could have possibly exposed against Errol Spence Jr., he was able to expose. Like I said, if Terrence Bud Crawford was able to show him, and I said this in my fight review, if he was able to show him that he could compete with him in terms of the power and go mano a mano and even at times back up Errol Spence Jr., there was no way that Errol Spence was going to win this fight because he already did not have the hand speed or the foot speed over him. He didn't have the feet over Terrence Bud Crawford. He didn't have the head movement. He didn't have the counterpunching ability. The power, the size, and the allegedly better chin than Terrence Bud Crawford, those were pretty much his main factors. That was going to have to be the main X factors over that of Terrence Bud Crawford. Because if he didn't have those, all of them, he was not going to win this fight.
Oh, and I am back with.
And not one of them showed up against that of Terrence Bud Crawford. And possibly even being the slightly bigger fighter. Not one of those factors showed up in the fight. There was not one.
Some more boxing. You guys heard the clip at the beginning. Mack, Brian McIntyre, the trainer of Terrence Crawford. He's currently in the UK. He's now working with Chris Eubank Jr., who has a fight this weekend. And he said he got a call or a text from Terrence Crawford yesterday stating that Errol Spence had actually triggered the rematch clause. As you guys know, when it comes to rematch clause, there's different contracts, but ultimately, usually, if there is a rematch clause in place, the fighter has up to a certain time to trigger that. the fighter has up to a certain time to trigger that rematch clause and activate it. If not, then the time runs out. For example, an example of a rematch clause being triggered would be Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz. He went to New York, fought Andy Ruiz, got upset in New York by Andy Ruiz, but because his team had a rematch clause, they were able to run it back in Saudi Arabia where he collected his belts back. Another example of a rematch clause expiring would be Canelo Alvarez payday versus Dimitri Bivol. And you had Canelo who got whooped by Dimitri Bivol, and
Very interesting that he brought up both of those examples. And you know why he brought up both of those examples? Because he doesn't like either one of those fighters. And I have no problem with him stating it because at the end of the day, Canelo Alvarez, he did get very badly beaten by Dimitri Bivol, in my view. And of course, Anthony Joshua, he also did end up getting badly beat up by that Evander Ruiz in the first fight. But you notice that Boxing Ego, a lot of the times that, and someone commented on this, and they said, well, what does it matter for? Because he was accurate with stating that they ended up getting beaten badly. And yes, that's true. But you'll notice that he'll never bring up Deontay Wilder half of the time when it comes to Tyson Fury or another fighter, that he tends to like. And why does he not like AJ? Because AJ was the main enemy of Deontay Wilder, when they were the two top heavyweights in the world. And he doesn't like Canelo Alvarez because, once again, Boxing Eagle is a part of the LDBC in new media. And his job is to try and make sure that Canelo Alvarez, that he is as degraded as possible.
seemingly didn't want any parts because he did have a rematch clause to fight Bivol, but he didn't want no parts of that. So he let the rematch clause expire.
Yeah, and you know what? Canelo Alvarez, in my view, made the right decision. He made the right decision because there are bigger fights for you out there. Dimitri Bivol is a guy that is about two weight classes bigger than you, more than likely. Canelo Alvarez tried to gain a little bit more muscle mass for that fight. It did not work for him. He had no stamina after the first 4 rounds. And on top of that, Dimitri Bivol is just a big guy. Dimitri Bivol is a guy that is bigger than Canelo. He is a natural light heavyweight guy. He's a guy that has great levels of power and great levels of skill. So once again, it would be like Terrence Bud Crawford getting in the ring with a prime Canelo or a prime Gennady Golovkin. It was always going to be a very tall task. So Canelo, in my view, did the right thing.
And end up fighting.
And in my view, Errol Spence should be trying to take a similar approach because heading into a rematch, back into that buzzsaw, if he loses in the same way that Terrence Bud Crawford, which in my view more than likely he will, his career is probably going to be over.
A 41-year-old.
I'm not saying that he won't potentially be able to make a run at 154, but it will pretty much be the end of his career within a couple of years. He's no longer going to be an A-plus level fighter.
Naughty. Hell no, guys. Hey, Mox's big dramas, punches, nothing. Rather than run it back with Dimitri Bivol, the guy that beat him, he'd rather fight Triple G, a guy he beat in the second fight many years before.
Yes, and also keep in mind, let it be stated, let it go on the record. The Boxing Eagle also was one of the guys that was claiming that Canelo Alvarez at one point in time should rematch Bivol. Then he was claiming that he shouldn't. So Boxing Eagle doesn't really know what he wants for Canelo, except for him to lose multiple times in a row because, once again, he doesn't like Canelo. His main job is to make sure, once again, with the LDBC and new media, they're a pro-black cult. So their job is to make sure that fighters like Canelo don't make it to the top of the pound-for-pound list in the first place.
When he was at least a little bit younger. So, Errol Spence, love him or hate him, this is not even about if you give him a chance in the rematch or not.
Which I don't. I give Errol Spence Jr. About a 10 to 20% chance in the rematch. I'll give him a 20% chance because you can never underestimate an elite level fighter like what Errol Spence Jr. is. And I expect him to come even more prepared. But I think it's going to end up a lot like the Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz rematch, where it'll maybe be a little bit more competitive in certain rounds, but with Terrence Bud Crawford still mainly getting that of the better hits, and with Terrence Bud Crawford eventually stopping him. It may end up a little bit later. It may end up lasting maybe the full 12 rounds, but Errol Spence is, once again, more than likely going to get very badly hurt in this fight.
Is as advertised. He never quit, even though he was getting pretty well demolished by Terrence Crawford. Crawford had a great game plan, and everything seemingly worked. That night, Errol Spence had the flattest performance I've ever seen from him. he looked off.
Well, the reason why he had the flattest performance ever is because he was stepping into the ring with an all-time great level fighter. And he had never stepped into the ring with an all-time level fighter ever, in his career before. When it came down to it. Is that me saying that Errol Spence is all hype? No. But at the end of the day, there is levels. And I'm sorry, but there's Terrence Crawford is pretty much the perfect type of fighter to beat someone like Errol Spence Jr. Someone who is quicker footed than him, someone who has quicker hand speed, someone who has around the same level of power, if not even more power than him. When it comes down to it, and someone who has better head movement. Terrence is almost like the perfect type of fighter to defeat Errol Spence Jr. If Errol Spence Jr. is Superman, then Terrence Bud Crawford is Kryptonite, because he was almost the perfect type of style. He was almost specifically built to beat that of Errol Spence Jr.
It looked like some things didn't go well, and he ended up losing to Terrence Crawford. For the belts that he collected, 3 belts, Crawford had 1. Now Crawford has all belts in the welterweight division. But I got to give Errol Spence a lot of credit, because this is definitely a true stubborn fighter and a fighter going against the grain, because many people said, oh, I don't need a rematch, and, a rematch is not needed because we got a conclusive.
I don't think it's needed either. I do give Errol Spence credit because it shows a lot of grit and it shows a lot of heart and want to improve and, want to prove that he's still the best out there. I understand that, but, sometimes we just got to lick our wounds and kind of retreat and say, you know what, I gotta really improve here. Because a lot of times we just let our pride way too much get in the way. But I understand, because these fighters, once again, they're bred and they're born to believe from a very young age that they're eventually going to be the best fighters in the world when it comes down to it. And on top of that, this is not a game where you can wait around for a super duper long time. At the end of the day, Errol Spence and Terrence Bud Crawford, they're not youngsters. They're not youngins, if you want to put it in that way. Terrence Bud Crawford is going to turn 36, I believe, very soon. And Errol Spence Jr., he's like 33, 34 years old. So at the end of the day, he may not be able to wait for that much longer. So Errol Spence may look at it as if it's pretty much now or never.
Effort in the first fight, Spence Crawford.
But just in my view, I would take at least 2 or 3 fights before I fight Terrence Bud Crawford in a rematch. Just me personally, but we'll see.
But Errol Spence is clearly defiant. He's going against, I guess what you could say, conventional wisdom or popular opinion, because some people say, hey, stay away, take some tune-ups, don't do it. Errol Spence he had a time limit on the rematch clause, and from what Bomac is saying, he's expressed his interest in wanting a rematch. Now, the interesting thing here is, with this rematch, they're saying that the winner, before we had a winner for Spence Crawford, they said the winner of this particular fight, the winner will have the power to dictate what weight class the fight happens at. So if that's the case, we now know the winner is Terrence Crawford. So Crawford can choose 147 or do the fight at 154.
Very interested to see if Ego's going to possibly make the excuse that the fight should be held at 154 because Errol Spence didn't look the same, and it's possibly that he was weight drained. Do I believe that? No, I don't.
Or I guess anywhere in between there. They try to take it, I'm getting it back. And if they hit me, they gotta get taxed. I'm making at 154, or I guess anywhere in between there, presumably like some kind of catch weight if he wanted to, because he was the winner. And I think he'll get the lion's share of the money because he is the undisputed champion. Now Errol Spence has no belts. So that's interesting. To be honest, it looked like both fighters struggled to make the weight of 147 pounds. I made several videos talking about it. Crawford's face looked gone.
Well, you thought that Terrence Bud Crawford was weight drained. That's the narrative that you were trying to pull out there. And you said that Errol Spence, that he looks good, he looks fine and all sort of stuff, because once again, you had a personal problem with that of the Terrence Bud Crawford camp. Now, at the end of the day, if you thought that Crawford looked drained, that's all up to you. But it was very clear with the narratives that Eagle was trying to put out there, or at least with the side bias, that he had more of a problem with Crawford than he ever did Spence. It was very clear who he was rooting for.
I had never seen Crawford look like sucked up like that on a fight week where he looked ghastly.
Well, then you must not watch many of his weigh-ins, because I've seen him look like that several times.
But the difference is I underestimated Errol Spence, and because he hired a nutritionist and it looked like he was, he looked to be ripped and in shape. You didn't know how his body was feeling, and it looks, in hindsight, now that we have a conclusive decision and effort and who won and whatnot, it looks to me that Errol Spence was spent, you know. I should say.
Well, you can say that all you want to. I'm not going to say that because, in my view, I don't want to hear any excuses. At the end of the day, people can say that, oh, well, Errol Spence didn't look the same all they want to. And I heard many people state that. And I myself predicted Errol Spence to win the fight. But it was very clear that a lot of the same faults that I had seen from Errol Spence, they were always there. Now, there are certain things that, he did in this fight. Maybe you could argue, that maybe he didn't do in other fights. Would I argue that? I'm not necessarily sure if I would. But because the thing is that people say, well, he did things in this fight that he wouldn't do in other fights. That's what all-time great fighters do to you. When you face an all-time great fighter, the fighter doesn't look the same anymore because they start doing certain things that may be looking, a little bit out of place for them because they're a little bit uncomfortable and they're trying to find new answers that they've never had to search for before because they're like, I don't have the answers for this guy. So if I'm going to beat this guy, I have to try to get something else in there, something that I'm not comfortable with. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, all that does is leave you more open for punches or counters.
Errol Spence, because it looked like he left everything at the gym and put up really a completely flat performance. And I know.
And I'm not saying, once again, that it's not good to try new things, but you have to work on them in practice. You have to work on them in sparring. That's why it's very important to be a multi-dimensional fighter.
Some people might not understand what I'm talking about.
And Spence, in my view, is a multi-dimensional fighter. It's just that he fought a fighter that was better than him in every category.
Well, that's all right. I don't really care. But at the end of the day, I've seen matches that are stylistic mismatches where someone just has superior speed and athleticism. That's not what this fight looked like.
No, this fight was one of those fights.
People were saying this fight was going to be Hagler-Hearns, and then when the fight happened, it looked like a one-sided beatdown, as if they were never on the same spectrum. Even Crawford's team says stuff like post-fight, they thought the fight was going to be a bit tougher. So I don't really know anyone who envisioned or predicted.
Well, there's many fighters and there's many athletes that always say that. Like when you ask certain tennis players or when you ask certain fighters, when they win their first belt or when they win their first Grand Slam or something like that, there are certain people that say that it was the hardest thing they've ever done. There are certain people that say, wow, it was actually relatively easier than what I thought it was going to be. And that's because their preparation was so severe and so extreme and so good that when they finally got in the ring, and because they were probably already a level above that fighter or that particular athlete anyway, that it pretty much came very easy to them.
The fight to be that one-sided. Even if Crawford was to win, I think people expected a little bit more. So whatever.
I did, but once again, once I seen that the power of Terrence Bud Crawford was competing with Errol Spence Jr., I knew that the fight was over.
Was going on.
Because as long as Terrence Bud Crawford had the power to compete with Errol Spence Jr. and knock him down and knock him out, there was no way Errol Spence was going to win that fight. No way. He did not have the hand speed. He did not have the foot speed over Terrence Bud Crawford. He didn't have the head movement. If he was able to knock Errol Spence down and back him up, there was no chance that Errol Spence was going to win this fight. And I said that in my fight prediction. I just didn't think that that was going to happen.
And that could be credit to Errol Spence, because if something really did go wrong in training camp, which some people suggest based on given the flat performance from Errol Spence, that might be a reason why he feels confident, I could do 1,000 times better than I did in the first fight. So that's just.
And personally, in my view, even if Errol Spence does possibly come in better shape for this fight or come in a little bit better, do I give him a big chance over Terrence Bud Crawford? No, not really. And the reason why that is because even if he becomes a better version of himself in this fight, Terrence Crawford is going to have such a mental edge in this fight over Errol Spence, because Errol is now going to be watching out and probably be a little bit more tentative than what he ever was before. And on top of that, Terrence is just going to have such a mental edge because he's going to be free flowing in there. He completely dominated Errol Spence the first time around. So when he fights him this time, I guarantee you that the anxiety is going to be massively reduced.
Theory that they know something that happened in the training camp and they feel they can correct that and put up a better effort. So a better effort doesn't necessarily mean a win. I think, and I'm going to stand on this, I really think Errol Spence put himself in between a rock and a hard spot, just how he went about it. He said to the world that it's strap season and Mr. No Tune-Ups and these types of things. And then at the end of the day, he negotiated himself out of his leverage. He gave up a lot.
I'm also not a big fan of the excuse, and it's somewhat of a valid excuse, but in my view, I'm not sure if I would go quite as far with it. When people say that, oh, well, he was off for a year. If you're off for 2 or more years, then I understand it a little bit because that's being off for a very decently long time. But for a year, I mean, there are certain fighters that only fight once a year. When Dimitri Bivol beat Canelo Alvarez, he had only fought, I believe, one time the prior year. When you talk about Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk, when both of those fights occurred, both times a year had happened between them when Alexander Usyk fought Anthony Joshua and dominated him both times. So at the end of the day, was it really because he was off for a year? I'm not saying that it wasn't a little bit of a factor, but at the end of the day, was it the main factor? No.
He didn't do a tune-up. His team said to walk away from Crawford because he's demanding too much, and he stubbornly stuck to what he believed in. And now he's doing the same thing. I don't know as far as his team, what they're suggesting, but a lot of people, I know he has to hear the voices and things like that. So if he has activated the rematch clause, most people that watched the fight said, don't bother. Why bother? We already know it's going to happen. Even Terrence Crawford's team, they're saying the same thing. They're like, it's going to be the same thing no matter what the weight class is. Terrence Crawford is just
I agree with that.
a better fighter. He's the more prepared fighter. He's the more skillful fighter. He has more tools in his toolkit. And Errol Spence believes otherwise. So it looks like we're going to run this fight back. It is what it is. That's the point of a rematch clause. If a guy is a champion and he extended the olive branch and an opportunity to his opponent to make a fight, and then he loses the fight, then he technically gets an opportunity to run that back. And that's what Errol Spence is getting. So we have to just endure it and we have to respect it. Despite if you think Errol Spence can win or not, contractually, he's obligated to take the match, and that's Terrence Crawford. And Crawford said this in post-fight interviews. He did a couple interviews, and he says, I'll have to honor the fight with Errol Spence. Lastly, from me, Ego Stradamus strikes again. This is exactly why I told you, for me, I wasn't going to overly get excited or talk about a fight with Terrence Crawford versus Canelo, or a fight with...
Well, it might be that fight isn't going to happen. Not unless Canelo Alvarez possibly loses to Jermell Charlo. I mean, maybe if he beats Jermell Charlo, maybe it'll happen. Do I think that the fight is going to happen? No, more than likely not. They're just too different in terms of weight classes. Of course, I don't think Canelo is really a natural 168 pounder. He's a natural 160 pounder. But going up to fight Canelo Alvarez, especially if he has a good showing against Jermell Charlo, that's going to be a very daunting task.
Terrence Crawford,
even though Canelo Alvarez has lost about one level,
and
if not even two.
Charlo. Not only does Canelo and Charlo have a fight pretty much this month, September 30th, and it's August 31st, right? So in the next 30 days or so, they have a fight. But in addition to that, now Errol Spence has triggered his rematch clause according to Team Crawford. So it is what it is. There's no need to talk about Canelo and Crawford. He has to handle business again versus Errol Spence. And this is what I said. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Best in the business. The future.
That's pretty much about it. This is pretty much what I predicted as well. Errol Spence is one of the top fighters in the world, or at least was. And once again, I'll have to do a top 10 pound per pound list at the end of the year or in January. That's when I usually do them. But I'm not even sure if Errol Spence, after that ass whooping that he took, would be even within my top 10 pound for pound. He certainly can't be within my top 5 anymore. But when you talk about the top, the bottom 5, then we're talking about Dimitri Bivol. We're talking about Devin Haney, Shakur Stevenson, possibly Jamel Charlo, Teofimo Lopez, and other fighters like that. Is he even on those guys' level? I'm not quite so sure. Because right now he doesn't have any belts. And I usually have a rule on my pound for pound list that unless you're a very accomplished fighter or undefeated or one of the top fighters in the world in a new weight class, that if you don't have any belts, you're not usually on my top 10 pound for pound list. But, it is what it is. Anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. We'll see how this fight goes. I believe more than likely that the same thing is going to happen, but you never personally know. So we'll see. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. I give Errol Spence a certain amount of credit. In my view, I would have probably taken a couple of other fights, a couple of good fights at 154, then maybe possibly having the fight happen at 154. But, I understand why Errol Spence is doing this too. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.